Hello and welcome to part number 4 of the Blazor blog series. In this part we are going to implement and use entity framework so that our blog posts are coming from a database. To be more exact, we're using a SQLite database. Before we start, one more hint. If you want to dive deeper into Blazor WebAssembly, I created a bootcamp, a Blazor WebAssembly full stack bootcamp, where you're going to learn Blazor WebAssembly with Web API, Entity Framework, and SQLite. And in this bootcamp, you're going to build a classic online browser game where users can register and log in with JSON web tokens, and with that, these users can create an army of fighters, meaning knights, mages, and archers, build these units, and then fight against other users and climb the leaderboard to become the best warrior of them all. Okay, that's just a side note, so if you want to have a look, the link is in the description below, or you can watch a 2-hour preview here on YouTube. Just check out the info card. Now, before we start with Entity Framework, one more thing I want to mention. You can see the code already of the get blog post by URL method here. I have already committed this to the GitHub repository. You will find the link in the description as well. And as you can see here, we just used get from JSON async and then the blog post with the given URL here. But I have implemented or added a 404 not found if the URL, wasn't found. But we did not really react to that. And with this code here, we do that now. So instead of calling get from JSON async directly, we first call get async with the given URL. And then we check if the status code is not 200 OK, then we go to the content of the HTTP result or HTTP response message, as you can see here. And then with the content, we can read the result as a string and then use console write line to display that in the console, for instance. Or what I did here is I just set the title of the blog post to the message we get. And if the status code is 200 OK, then we use read from JSON async to get the actual blog post. I can show you this in the browser, of course. So we just reload the application here. And when we click read more, everything works as expected. But for instance, if we use new tutorial 2, we don't find the post, and then we say this post does not exist because this is the message we get from our call. If you have a look at the network tab, you see down here we get the 404, and in the preview we see that this is the actual message. And when we go back to the code of the blog controller here, there it is. Here it says if the post is null, so we could not find the post with the given URL, then we send a not found back with the message this post does not exist. And this is what you see on the client then. Okay, but that's actually just an addition to the last part. And now let's do entity framework. So how are we going to do this? First, we stop the application from running, and then we have to prepare some stuff. We have to prepare entity framework, or we have to install some packages and the entity framework tool. For instance, with the package manager console, we say .NET EF, and here we can see that I have installed the entity framework core .NET command line tools in the version 5 RC2. So this is the release candidate of .NET 5 actually. Yes, I installed this, although we created this blog with .NET Core 3.1. Now, depending on when you're watching this video, of course, there might be .NET 5 available already, and the chances are high because when I know correctly, in 5 days, .NET 5 should be released. But anyways, let's uninstall the .NET EF tools first, and then you can see how the preparations work in detail. So what we have to do is we type .NET tool install and then -- global and then .NET EF. And of course it's not install first, it's uninstall if you have already installed the command line tool. So .NET tool uninstall global .NET EF to uninstall the tools first. This was quick. And then when we have a look again with .NET EF, there's nothing there. So what we can do is we just install it with the latest stable release of .NET or .NET Core. And then we should see that the latest version is something like, I guess, 3.1.9 or something like that. Yeah, 3.19, there was it already. You can see that version 3.19 was successfully installed. And now we got the Entity Framework Core .NET Command Line Tools 3.1.9. As I said already, it could be the case that you're going to install the version of .NET 5. But anyways, these are just the tools. And apart from that, we need some other stuff. We need some packages, and we can do that again with the Package Manager console here. Or what we can also do is in the Solution Explorer, we right-click the Blazor blog server project and then say Manage NuGet Packages to install all our packages. And the very first one we need is called Microsoft Entity Framework Core. There it is. 149 billion downloads already. You can see it here. Entity Framework Core is a lightweight and extensible version of the popular Entity Framework data access technology. And you see again, latest stable is 3.1.9. Beautiful. Let's just install this one here. Click OK. And I accept, and then it's going to install Entity Framework Core. But that's not it. We need another package as well, and this would be the design package. And as you can see in the description now, shared design time components for Entity Framework Core tools. So we need them as well. Latest stable again, 3.1.9, install these. And since I want to use the SQLite database, we also need the last package, and then we are done with the preparations. So Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite, that should be it. SQLite database provider for Entity Framework Core. And also the latest stable. Okay, I think when .NET 5 has been released, I will make a video about migrating or updating this version of the blog to .NET 5. So that we are really using the latest versions here. Okay, I think everything is installed now. And I moved this one away. Jesus, what have I done here? Anyway, so Entity Framework is installed, and now we can actually use it, of course. And the very first thing we should do is implementing a data context. And for that, we go to the server project again and create a new folder first. Call this thing data. And then we create a new class, add class, and call this data context. Now this class here inherits db context, and this doesn't seem to be available here, so we have to add the reference Microsoft Entity Framework Core, the one we have just installed, and this will be our database context. With the help of this database context, we are able to access our blog posts in the database then. Let me just take a sip from my coffee. Great. It's quite early, 6 a.m. So I need a little bit of coffee. Sorry about that. Well, anyways, and after that we have to add a constructor. And this constructor looks like that, public data context, but we need an argument, and these would be db context options, and we call this options, and we also have to use the base constructor with this argument as well. And we also have to give this thing a type of this current class. Okay, so this is our constructor then. And then the next thing already we have to add is a DB set, a database set. We add this as property. And this property will be of type DB set. And then we use the type we want to see in the database, so the blog post in our case, and we call this blog post because this then is the name of the resulting table, and usually you would just pluralize the name of this type. Now I have to explain this in a bit more detail, I guess. If you're not familiar with Entity Framework or object relational mappers in general, what does that mean? Well, with Entity Framework, we are able to map our objects, our relational objects, which is the blog post in essence, to a database. So we are creating our models, like the blog post model. And when we have a look at the blog post model and we want to see a representation of this model in the database, then we can use an object relational mapper framework, for instance, something like Entity Framework, that will then map this model to a database table. And with Entity Framework, the great thing is we can use something called code first migration. This means we write our code first, not our code first. As I said, it's quite early in the morning, and then we have all these properties here. And Entity Framework will create a table and also all these fields here with the help of that model. So in essence, you never have to touch the database or create it by yourself. Entity Framework does all the work for you. What you have to do is create your model, then the data context, some other stuff we will see in this video in a minute. And then you have them available in your database, and they are stored persistently. Everything is great. You can be happy. You can go to sleep and never worry about losing your data. Okay, so Entity Framework is nice, and I know that some of you like Dapper and want to use Dapper instead of Entity Framework and want to see me using Dapper instead of Entity Framework. And don't get me wrong, I like Dapper. I used Dapper before, especially in some contract work, but Dapper is Dapper is faster, that's true, than Entity Framework, but it is not such a big ORM or object relational mapping framework like Entity Framework. With Entity Framework you have some more features like the code first migration, for instance. When you're using only Dapper, you have to create the database by yourself. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know everything, but with Dapper what you can do is, yes, map your models with the database tables and query your data. So that's nice, but with Entity Framework you get this all-in-one package where you just migrate or add migrations, meaning creating the tables with the help of your code, and also access and query all the data and store it, update it, and so on. Well, long story short, that's Entity Framework. So with the help of Entity Framework, we create a SQLite database in a minute. And the first table we are going to create is this blog posts table here. And with the help of the DB context, as you can see it here, it represents a session with the database, and it can be used to query and save instances of your entities or objects, in our case the blog posts. DB context is a combination of the unit of work and repository patterns. Yes, that's nice. And typically you create a class that derives from DB context and contains DB set with your entity. Again, in our case, the blog post, properties for each entity in the model. And with the DB set properties, we have a public setter. They are automatically initialized when the instance of the derived context is created, and so on. Okay, I think we're done here. That's enough theory. And if you have a question, just comment below this video. All right, now what would be the next thing? This would be a connection string. We need a connection string, and we create this connection string in the app settings JSON. Now the connection string is necessary to tell Entity Framework where the database is. And we can do this like that. We add a new section here, call this connection strings. And by default, you can add as many connection strings as you want here, but by default, the very first connection string is called default connection. And for SQLite, this is quite easy. You just say data source is, and then the name of your database file, because in SQLite we just have a database file. For instance, we can say Blazor blog.db, and that's it. And what's going on here? Member name should be a string in double quotes. Yeah, it is. So what's the problem? Let me just save this. Oh, there's a semicolon instead of a colon. Okay, now it works. So we've got our connection string, and the next thing is to register this DB context in the configure services method of the startup class. So again, in the server project down here, no, down here in the startup CS, we've got this beautiful configure services method. And up here we can say services add DB context, and the type is our data context. Of course, we could use another name, but well, data context is, I don't know, some kind of best practice, I guess. So, and with this data context, let me just add this class here. So we add the reference for server data. Now it's working. And then we add a lambda expression where we say that we want to use SQLite. And this is another method. And for that, is it already available? I don't know. Okay, it does need an argument, and that's what we're going to give this method in a second. So use SQLite, and in here we give this method a connection string, or the, yeah, in essence, the connection string of the database. And for that we add the configuration, this thing here. And with the configuration, we get the data from the app settings JSON we just used a minute before. And here we can say get connection string. And this is just a convention in essence, because with get connection string, the method is looking up a section, or looking for a section called connection strings. That's why we called it that way. You could also add it here in the logging section. I don't know why you would do that, but you could do this, of course. So I get connection string, and then again in double quotes we say default connection, and that's it. So now the DB context is registered, we configured everything, and now we are able to start the first migration. For that, again, we go to the package manager console, give us some space, and now we can use the .NET Entity Framework tools to add the first migration, and we do that with .NET EF migrations. Or let me just show you what's actually available. So I guess, is it .NET EF-H? Yes, I think so. And as you can see down here, the commands available are database, DB context, and migrations. So not really a lot. And that's good because we only need migrations and database to do the migrations and update the database. So let's use .NET EF migrations, and then we say add, and let's call this initial because this is the initial migration. So .NET EF migrations, add initial, hit return, drink your coffee. And the build failed. And why is that? Services add DB context. I'm missing a using directive. Are we? No, not really. Services add DB context. Let me just have a look in another project. What did I do there? Add DB context. It's actually exactly the same. Add DB context, data context. I really don't see the problem. Let me just build this again. Entity framework core does not exist. Okay, it's building now. Now it works. Go back to the startup. This error is gone. Let's try to build this again. Build started. Maybe again. Drink your coffee. Build succeeded. Okay, great. So maybe I did not save a file. Could be the case. Happens sometimes. And now the build succeeded. It is done. Great. You can also see that you can remove a migration, of course, with EF migrations remove. But we don't want to do that. We want to have a look at the migration. Because what Entity Framework did now is add a new folder called migrations. Created a snapshot. That's not interesting for us. For us, interesting, really interesting is this thing here. The file of the migration. It's called initial because we told Entity Framework to call it initial. And then you see two methods, up and down. And when we now update the database and actually execute this migration or run this migration, then you will see what Entity Framework is going to do. It will create a table with the name blog posts and with all these fields here. And you can also see that Entity Framework is so smart that it will create a primary key for the field ID. Now, of course, this is just a convention again, and in my courses, I see some students that really have, well, they struggle with these things that just seem to magically happen with .NET applications. In essence, there's lots of stuff, Jesus, that seem to magically happen, but most of the time it's just convention. It's just by convention. So when you call a field ID or a property ID and then use Entity Framework to create a table, Entity Framework will assume that this really is the primary key of your entity, and that's why it is using, or why it's creating a primary key for that field. So when you add relations to your database, like let's say we will add users or authors that have several blog posts, and in this entity we will add a list of blog posts, or in a blog post we will add an author ID. That's a better example, I guess. If we would add an author ID and also an author property, and of course we have a model author or user or whatever, then Entity Framework would assume that this is a foreign key, of course. So it would create the foreign key. So you don't have to tell Entity Framework that. Of course, you can do it. You can use something called Fluent API, for instance, or just some attributes in your model to tell Entity Framework exactly what to do. You could also, for instance, just ignore some fields and not store them in the database. This is all stuff you can configure, but there are a lot of things that work just by convention, and this is what some students struggle with, me included sometimes, of course. But again, long story short, we have a table that will be created with all these fields and also with the primary key for the ID field. All right, and the down method then would be called if we use this EF migrations remove. Oh no, that's not true, I guess. If you would remove this migration again or just roll it back, that's the term I was looking for, then you can see that actually this table would just be removed or dropped. Okay, I would say this looks nice, and let's create the database now. So back to the package manager console. Now we can say .NET EF, and now we're using database and just update. I know maybe it's strange to say update here because we do not really have a database yet. But anyways, this works. So .NET EF database update. It will build the application again and then create our database. And it is already done. And my coffee is already cold. So here it is now, Blazor block DB. And of course, this is not what we want to see here. So we need an application to watch this database or to have a look at this database. And there's a beautiful tool called DB Browser for SQLite. Let me just go back to Chrome. There it is. And with SQLite browser org, you can see this is the tool we can use. It is free and available for, I think, every platform: Windows, macOS, Homebrew, Linux, and so on. And there's also a portable version available for Windows. And let me just open it now. Yep, there it is. And I also need the path to the database. Let me just right click, copy full path, and now back to the DB browser. We open the database and use the path here. Yeah. Okay, and now it crashed. No, it doesn't. Did not crash. Yeah, let's just remove this file name and just open the folder, and now we can open it. Okay, great, and here it is. This is the table, and here you can also see the blog posts table, again with the primary key ID and all the properties, and we can also browse the data, and you see that the table is empty. But what we can do is we can of course insert a blog post, insert a new record in the current table. Let's call this first. Title is my first blog post. Content, let's say description: in a database. That's my post in the SQLite DB. Got an author, date created. Let's just say this is the 1st January. It is published and not deleted. Okay. Write the changes. Refresh the database, and this should be it, I guess. We've got one blog post here in the database. Now, of course, we want to see that post, so we have to go to the blog post service, actually, right here. Okay, so now to get all the blog posts, we first need the data context in the, oh no, what I'm doing here, this is the service, this is the client service. No, we have to go to the controller. That was correct. Yeah. And now we need a constructor. That's what I wanted to do. So let's add a constructor here in the blog post controller. And now down here we have to inject the data context. So we say data context, call this context. And what we can do now is we create and assign the field context. We add an underscore. And then we've got our context available, and instead of returning these posts here, we can do context blog posts. That's it. And then we are accessing the blog post from the database. And to get the single post from the database, we say not posts first or default, we say context blog posts first or default, and so on. And that's actually it. So we can remove these here. And now you see that we are only accessing the blog posts from our database. We're saving everything. Go back to the console and let's say .NET watch run again to run the application. Go back to Chrome. Close this, we don't need it anymore. Go to home. Hey, there it is already. Isn't that great? That's really fast. I like that. Welcome to my blog, my first blog post in a database. We can click read more, and this is the actual blog post from the SQLite DB. And of course, if you use a wrong URL, it is null and this post does not exist. Great, that's it. Sorry if this part is or was a bit confusing. I don't know, I guess I'm a bit tired still, quite early, need more coffee. I hope the next part won't be that confusing. But still, if you liked that part, I'd really appreciate it if you click the like button or even subscribe to my channel. It would really help. Thank you very much for watching. And don't forget, if you want to dive deeper and have maybe a bit more structure and not that chaos in the lectures, then have a look at the Blazor WebAssembly full stack bootcamp, link in the description, or watch the preview here on YouTube. I would be really happy to see you in the course. Okay, thank you very much for watching again, and I see you next time.